Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, in Politics on Trial, I'm going to be talking about the other epoch-making trial of a king in the middle of a revolution, the one that usually is placed alongside the trial and execution of Charles I. This is the trial and execution of Louis XVI in the middle of the French Revolution. It looks like it's a very similar story. Two kings, a revolution, they lose their heads. It's so different. It's easy to see why the trial of Louis XVI and the trial of Charles I get run together, as they often do. They are the two great regicide trials. They end the same way, guillotine, beheading, but it's death to the king and death to the monarchy. That was the aim in both cases, that in killing the king, the republic would be consecrated in blood, and monarchy itself, with all of its trappings, would be murdered too. Cromwell said, in killing the king, we kill the crown. In both cases, the execution followed very quickly after the end of legal proceedings. Charles 3 days later, Louis 4 days later. Both men behaved very bravely. Once they were told they were going to die, they accepted. There was nothing they could do about it. They both, in their different ways, resolved to die as martyrs to kingship. The goal was to abolish monarchy, and in both cases it failed. 11 years after the execution of Charles I, 22 years after the execution of Louis XVI, the monarchy was back. Charles II, Louis XVIII. Of course, there are differences, one of which is that though monarchy returned in France in the form of Louis's brother, it didn't last for long. There were more republics to come, many more republics to come, and not many more kings. And France is now a republic, which is why France still thinks of itself as a country that was born out of its revolution. England, Britain, the United Kingdom never became a republic again. Monarchy stuck when it was restored. It had to go through its own second revolution, the revolution of 1688, 1689, and it became something more like a parliamentary monarchy. But still, we have a king. The French don't. So in that respect, at least, these are two very different stories. But that's not the difference I'm interested in today. I think there's another difference. Don't want to say a bigger difference, but in terms of the events themselves, a more profound difference. And that's the trials. The trial of Charles I and the trial of Louis XVI were completely different kinds of events, kinds of proceedings, kinds of political happenings. And there are lots of different ways to describe that difference. The simplest, the way to describe it in just one sentence, is to say that the trial of Charles I was not actually a trial. The trial never happened. Charles refused to plead. His accusers wanted to go through the process of putting charges to him, summoning evidence and witnesses, having a proper deliberation on the case. But Charles wouldn't allow it. He refused to recognize the authority of the court. He refused to accept any aspect of the proceedings as legitimate, and he refused to plead. He was asked repeatedly, would he plead guilty, not guilty? He refused, and under English law at that time, a refusal to plead was taken as a plea of guilty, which short-circuited the trial, to the frustration of his prosecutor, John Cook, who still summoned witnesses for the sentencing section of proceedings, but that had to be done in private. The public trial was aborted. The trial of Louis XVI was a trial. It was a real trial. It went ahead. There were charges. There was evidence. The case was put and the case was answered. There was deliberation. There was a judgment. There was no judgment as such in the case of Charles I because the judgment was automatic. Charles judged himself in the eyes of the court by refusing to plead. So one was a trial and one wasn't a trial, but even that doesn't quite capture how big the difference is. I would say there are three ways of putting this. The first is that The trial of Charles I was the trial of a king. It didn't happen, but when he was put in the dock and refusing to plead, all the way through to when he was executed, he was still king. He wasn't deposed. He didn't abdicate. He didn't have the crown taken off him while he was alive. The crown was taken from his head in the act of severing his head from his body. That's what Cromwell meant when he said, "We kill the king, we kill the crown," in the same blow. Louis XVI was not a king when he was put on trial. He was Louis Capet, citizen of the new French Republic, because he had lost the crown. He had been forced to abdicate in August of 1792. The trial began in December of 1792 and it was completed in January of 1793. So for those 5-6 months, Louis was not a king. He was a citizen. And that is one of the reasons why the trial was able to go ahead. Another reason the trial was able to go ahead is that Louis did not refuse to recognize the authority of the court. He didn't go out of his way to acknowledge the authority of the court, and in this case, the court was the Revolutionary Convention, essentially the parliamentary or legislative body that was governing France at that time, a single chamber with all of the power in it. That body of 700 plus men, still all men, this was still a man's world. He didn't say, "You have the right to try me," but he definitely did not say, "You don't have the right to try me." And more than that, he offered a defense. Charles refused to offer a defense. Louis defended himself. The charges were put, and he made a case against them. He did plead. He said he was innocent of the charges as put. That is why a trial could happen. But in some ways, the biggest difference of all is actually not to do with the trial itself, but to do with the assembly, the convention. The parliament that wanted to try Charles and ended up passing the judgment of death on him had been purged. Cromwell, the army, had purged it. They had purged it of anyone who might be sympathetic to the king. They had also purged it of people who, while not sympathetic to the king, might have wanted to do a deal with the king, crucially Presbyterians, who saw the king as a way of striking a deal against the Cromwell, or as they were known, independent faction. Those factions were stripped out. They were barred, physically barred, so that Charles was able to say, although it slightly contradicted his view that he didn't recognize the authority of the proceedings at all, "I don't recognise this as a parliament because there are no lords here." Significant numbers of MPs had also been banned from taking part. The men who judged Charles had been reduced to a corps who could be counted on to know what to do. In the case of Louis, the tribunal, the convention before which he appeared, 700 plus people, had not been purged. It would be purged. It would be purged after the trial and execution of the king. The purging, which would include not just the members of the convention, but far wider in Paris and French society, is what came to be known as the Terror. The enemies of the Jacobins were excluded, and then the Jacobins started to eat themselves, and the Terror terrorized its own proponents. But that was all after the trial. Before the trial, during the trial, that assembly still contained a wide range of opinion, including a wide range of opinion about what to do with the king. And that's what makes the whole trial a much more fraught, in its way dramatic. The trial of Charles I is deeply dramatic if you like your dramas to be purely symbolic. But this one is more like a thriller. It's not just that no one quite knew what would happen, but no one quite knew which side would win. The central division is the one that has gone down in history as the central division of the revolution itself, in the convention between the Jacobins and the Girondins. The Jacobins were the radical wing of the revolution. Robespierre, Danton, Saint-Just, who came to prominence in the trial of Louis XVI. The Jacobins were the ones who were, by this point, after the king had abdicated and the country had become a republic, by this point they were Republicans by conviction. They absolutely believed in republicanism. They were united in being against monarchy. They were radical. They were also absolutely centered on Paris. Paris was their power base. This event was happening in Paris, so that was good news for the Jacobins. Paris, the street, as their enemies would say, the mob, the violence of the people of Paris, which was the engine room of radical revolution in France, and indeed of revolutionary violence. There was a lot of violence elsewhere, but the core was always understood to be Paris. These were the people represented by the likes of Robespierre. The Girondins were, by this point, also Republicans, because everyone was Republican, because France was now a republic, but they were more Republicans by default, not by conviction. It was a fact. And they had to make their peace with it, harder for some Girondins than others. The Girondins were a more diverse, more moderate, more complicated grouping in many ways than the Jacobins. They were the majority at this point, so the Jacobins had the advantage. This was happening on their home turf in Paris, but there were, at this time in the revolution, fewer of them in the assembly, in the convention itself. They were known as the Mountain. They sat up, high up in the building, looking down, threatening, jeering. The Girondins occupied the floor, but they were probably more divided. And that was partly because they didn't speak for Paris. They spoke for France. Indeed, they spoke for the France that was not Paris, for the provinces, for provincial towns particularly, more even than the countryside, in which opinion was also much more divided, including about the king. Many Girondins had worked with the king. Many Girondins weren't sure what to do about the king. Many Girondins were aware that the people who had elected them, many of them were still quite fond of the king. That division, Jacobin-Girondin, was played out through the question of what should we do about Louis XVI, or Louis Capet as he was now, because he was no longer king. And to start with, the positions were very clear. After August, when the king was removed from the throne following a violent, bloody event at the Tuileries in Paris, where both sides blamed the other for the bloodshed, the king was held under armed guard, effectively. He was a prisoner of the state. He was no longer king. He was a citizen. What should we do with him? The Jacobins knew what to do with him. They wanted him dead. They were absolutely clear and united on this. They wanted to proceed against the king. They weren't going to hold him. They weren't going to have a long, drawn-out debate. They, at this point, didn't want to put him on trial. They just wanted to institute the kind of proceedings against him which would be much more like the trial of Charles I, not a trial, a move to execution. This man is guilty. We don't need to ask him to plead. It doesn't matter what he pleads. He is guilty of being a king. Kings are the enemies of the revolution. This man is a threat to the revolution. He is still plotting against the revolution. We can hold him prisoner as long as we like. It is an affront to the revolution that this man is alive. He needs to die. That was the Jacobin position. And so we need to agree as a convention, as an assembly, legally. We need to do it properly. We don't want to do it just by sending someone to poison him. But we need to agree on his execution. The Girondins did not want to move against the king. They didn't know what to do with the king. Many of them definitely did not want to execute the king for a whole host of reasons, including, it has to be said, the fact that they were all aware what happened to the regicides who killed Charles I. The spectre of Charles I and his execution hung over this event, no question, and all of these people were well versed in that history. For the Jacobins, what happened to Charles is exactly what should happen to Louis, and anyone who thought otherwise was a coward, among other things. But there were Girondins who were more alive to the contingencies of history and the potential fate that awaits people who put their name to the death warrant of a king. But many others had other reasons for doubt. Some wanted to use the king as a bargaining chip. France was at war. Revolutionary France, the Republic, was at war with the monarchies of Europe in different guises. Maybe Louis could be a pawn in those games. Maybe he could be used as part of negotiations if the Republic got into trouble. Some of them had a lingering feeling that a revolution that killed a king would get out of hand. Many of them didn't want to kill the king because the Jacobins did want to kill the king. This was factional, raw factional politics. How do we know what to do? Well, we do what the other side don't want us to do. So to start with, one side wanted to move to judgment, one side wanted to slow it down. But the mood in Paris was against the Girondins on this question. They weren't going to let the king just sit there. They wanted something to happen to him. And then the positions flipped. The Girondins then accepted, if we are going to do something about the king, it is not simply going to be a rush to execution, which would give a victory to the Jacobins. We're going to have a real trial. We're going to put him on trial. We are going to draw up a charge sheet against him. We are going to hear evidence. Lawyers are going to be involved. This will be a legal proceeding, a recognizable legal proceeding. We will debate and discuss what happens during the trial. We will vote on a judgment, and then we will decide on punishment. We won't rush to punishment. The Girondins suddenly decided if they were going to act against the king, it would have to be a full trial. And then the Jacobins switched, having said, let's do something, let's move, let's proceed against the king, wanted to say, but not this, not a trial. We didn't mean those kinds of proceedings. And on that question, because they were in the minority, the Jacobins lost, and a trial went ahead. The majority, the moderate majority, won out. One of the questions for the Girondins was, how can you put him on trial? How can a king be tried? They could say, well, we can put him on trial because he's no longer a king. He's a citizen, and any citizen can be put on trial. All the citizens of France are liable to be subject to the rule of law. And the king is no different, Louis Capet. But then the problem was, but he's only been a citizen for 5 months. And though a lot of people were trying to mount evidence that even while basically a prisoner of the state, he had been conspiring against the revolution, writing letters, trying to stir up trouble, trying to make contact with royal courts outside of France. They knew the bulk of the charge sheet against him was not going to be for the stuff he had done when he was no longer king, because he was basically a prisoner. It would be for what he did when king. But then the question was, well, you say he's a citizen, and so he can be tried as a citizen, but you're saying the charges against him are when he wasn't a citizen, when he was a king, and kings are inviolable. And not only was he beyond criminal proceedings when he was an absolute monarch, Louis XVI, descendant of Louis XIV, descendant of a long line of French kings, an absolute ruler in an absolute monarchy. He was even inviolable after 1791, when the revolution had happened, and the revolution had instituted a new constitution, a monarchical constitution, with Louis as king, but a severely curtailed king. And in that constitution, it said he could not be charged. Proceedings could not be brought against him. And if they were to accuse him of anything, if proceedings were to be brought against him, they couldn't be criminal proceedings. It had to be a form of impeachment. That thing I talked about last time. He could be impeached under the Constitution, but he couldn't be subject to criminal proceedings. And the Girondin answer to this question was essentially to say, it's not that Louis has only been a citizen for 5 months. He was always a citizen. France only has citizens. Absolute monarchies are a nonsense. He was a citizen when that constitution was drawn up. Okay, he had the name of and the role of king. That was the role that had been assigned to him in this state. He was a man who had put on the mantle of kingship, initially born into it, and then under the constitution, chosen as the person who would be the executive of the state. But the Girondins said he was still underneath that, under the crown, a citizen. And so he can be charged as a citizen for things he did as king. And more than that, the terms of that constitution were a kind of contract between the people of France and this man, Louis Capet, who they said, we'll make you king and we will give you these rights, including the right not to be subject to these kinds of proceedings, if you do your duty. Well, he didn't do his duty, so he forfeited that right, and the people can withdraw their side of the bargain. He breached the terms of the contract. This is a contract between citizens, citizens to citizens. We're all just citizens. That's how he can be put on trial. The Girondin position was Louis had always been a citizen who, for much of his life, happened to be a king. The Jacobin position was he had never been a citizen and he still wasn't a citizen. The reason they didn't want a trial is because they wanted to say he's still a king. Once a king, always a king. The blood, not just of kingly inheritance in the sense that he inherited the throne, but of kingly crime, the blood of the French people, the things that he did as king. He can't just shake them off and say, I'm now a citizen. he still has all of the guilt, the trappings of kingship attached to his person, which means we can execute him because kings are the enemies of the revolution. He doesn't merit a trial because to merit a trial would imply that a defense is possible. And the Jacobin position was he can no more defend himself than Charles was willing to defend himself. These kings are all the same. They believe they rule by divine right. You take their crown away from them, they don't stop believing that. The only punishment that fits the crime of kingship is death. Girondin position, always a citizen. Jacobin position, never was a citizen, isn't a citizen now, always a king. And Louis's position was, I once was a king, and now I accept I am a citizen, in the sense that his defense was going to be, I plead innocent to these charges because I'm going to distinguish the different timeframes that we're talking about. Once I was the King of France, the rightful ruler of this country, and I had the rights of such a king under the time-honoured traditions and constitutional understandings of a divinely instituted monarchy, and I could do no crime. Then he said, I accept that in 1791 my position changed in the sense that I became a different kind of king, a constitutional king. But as the constitutional king, I didn't do anything that merits a criminal trial. And if you think I did do wrong, you have already punished me by removing the crown from me as specified in the Constitution. So you're trying me twice. And then there's a period when I was a citizen, during which time I have been your prisoner. So how could I be your enemy? Innocent in the first phase because I couldn't be guilty. Innocent in the second phase because insofar as I did anything wrong, I've already been punished. Innocent in the third phase because I can't do anything wrong now. You've got me under lock and key. That was Louis's defense. So 3 positions were established for this trial. Always a citizen, never a citizen, only a citizen now. Or to put it another way, the Jacobins said he was always a king. Louis said, I was once a king. The Girondins said, you were only ever a king on sufferance. The other thing that Louis did, which Charles didn't do, was agree to have lawyers. Charles refused that because even to accept legal representation would be to acquiesce in the authority of the court. Louis had no problem with it. Some of the Jacobins had a problem with it. They didn't want Louis to have lawyers. They wanted it to be more like the trial of Charles I. They weren't going to get their way. Louis had a number of lawyers. The leading lawyer, the man who would actually speak in his defense, was a man called Raymond de Sèze. But he didn't have many other legal rights. So the Girondins did want to present this as formal and recognizably legitimate legal proceedings, a criminal trial. The charge was treason. Everyone knew the punishment would be death if convicted of treason. But even on that question, as we'll see, there turned out to be a lot of wriggle room. But other features of a criminal trial were absent. Louis was not told the specifics of the charges he faced before they were read out to him in court. He was not shown the evidence, including the documents that would be produced against him. He was not given any opportunity to even check the validity of those documents, never mind to challenge their authenticity. He was presented with documents and told, these are yours, these are in your hand, this is your signature, this is the signature of the men who work for you. But he was never allowed to look. They could have been forgeries. So he had minimal legal rights, but enough for this to at least look like a trial. But in the first phase of it, the first part of the proceedings, which happened on the 6th of December, 1792, when Louis was summoned before the convention and had the charge sheet read out against him. He didn't have a lawyer to speak for him then, and he didn't have any preparation. He did not know what was coming. In the same way that Charles didn't know what was coming, but Charles immediately knew what to do, which was just to refuse to acknowledge any of it. Louis listened to the charge sheet against him, and he tried to answer the charges in his own name. He did it sitting in a chair. He wasn't a particularly impressive person. He was a bit roly-poly. He was a sort of pedestrian human being in some ways, but he was dignified. He was particularly dignified as Louis Capet, more in some ways than he had been as Louis XVI, stripped of some of the absurd trappings of royalty. And he put up a decent showing in that first hearing. He did his best. The charge sheet against him was 33 charges long, and it was everything that they could throw at him, as so often happens in these kinds of trials. They didn't have the time to come up with a shorter list of accusations. It was chronological. It started with the accusation that he had deliberately tried to suppress the Estates General, which was at the beginning of the revolution in 1789, through to 10th of August 1792, the massacre in the Tuileries that was blamed on him and his Swiss guards, the people who were meant to be guarding him. He was accused of having been responsible for the bloodshed of Parisians on that day and everything in between. So every reverse of the revolution, every defeat on the battlefield, every outbreak of violence in Paris, every rumour of conspiracy, the flight to Varennes in 1791 when Louis clearly was trying to escape and he was captured in disguise. All of it was thrown at him. And Louis tried to answer it. So on some of the early charges, he said, I was acting as a king. I was acting within my rights as a king. I was always trying to do my best for the people. On some of the others, he said, I have no knowledge of this. You tell me I'm responsible for this massacre that took place in Paris. It was nothing to do with me. For some of it, he said, that wasn't me. That was my ministers. I can't be answerable criminally for things that my ministers did. When documents that had been discovered in his royal apartments were presented to him showing that he was still conspiring against the revolution and writing letters trying to bribe and suborn representatives, trying to find foreign allies, he said, I don't recognize those documents. I don't believe that I wrote them. They're new to me. So on some of it, he pleaded ignorance. He didn't know. He couldn't remember. On some of it, he said, that is not fair. I am here to tell you I was doing my best as a king. On some of it, he said, you need to give me more time. In neither case was it a satisfactory occasion. The charge sheet against him was too long. It was too bitty. It didn't have a narrative thread running through it. And Louis's defense was also too bitty. What was he really saying? Was he saying he didn't remember, he didn't do these things, he did do these things, but he was willing to justify them and defend them? But it made everybody very uneasy. It made the Jacobins uneasy because they could sense that some people were sympathizing with this slightly hapless individual put in this awkward position. It made many Girondins uneasy because they weren't totally convinced they knew what the case against him was. And the key question, which is, since 1791, under the terms of the Constitution, if he were to be charged with anything, it would be impeachment, not criminal proceedings. That made a lot of people uneasy. But Louis also hadn't really defended himself. He hadn't made a case. So it was going to happen again. And the again was the formal part of the trial. And Louis's defense. Louis's defense took place on December the 26th. He had one more day in court. He only had 2 days in court, but still they were parts of a single proceeding. The second one, December the 26th, like the revolutionaries in England, these were revolutionaries. They don't do Christmas. Revolutionaries, on the whole, don't do Christmas. You could say that's one thing against them. On December the 26th, having heard a charge sheet which was much more coherent in the sense that second time around, his prosecutors presented it as a narrative, the story of the revolution, and how from day one, indeed before day one, from the convening of the Estates General, Louis had worked against it to subvert it. He had never, ever once not taken an opportunity to be its enemy. The story was that Louis was the enemy of the revolution. He had been when absolute ruler, he had been when constitutional ruler, he still was as citizen Louis, because he was still writing and conspiring and having his agents try and subvert the revolution. A coherent case was made against him, enemy of the state. Closer in some ways to what the Jacobins always thought the case should be. They didn't need a narrative. The Jacobin version of enemy of the state was, he's a king. Kings are the enemies of republics. Louis's defense, which was in this case not spoken by himself but by his lawyer, Monsieur Desèze, came in 3 parts. He delivered a long speech, Desèze. It was cold. This was the middle of winter in Paris. There were lots of people crammed in, so there were a lot of bodies warming up this room. But there was only, I think, 1 stove to heat the whole building. Still, Raymond de Sèze put so much into this. He got so exhausted, he was perspiring so much that after a couple of hours, he had to pause, and the king had to put in a request on behalf of his lawyer that his lawyer should be allowed to change his shirt. It was that kind of defense. A little like Sheridan in the impeachment of Warren Hastings, who, by the end of it, collapsed under the weight of his own rhetorical exertions. De Sèze offered a defense in three parts. The first was that Louis couldn't have been guilty in the way that the charge sheet made him out to be guilty for effectively constitutional reasons. So the case was made that when he was king, he was inviolable. When he was constitutional monarch, there was a deal, there was an arrangement. It's in the Constitution. He couldn't be subject to these kinds of proceedings. He could only be removed if he did wrong. He didn't accept that he'd done wrong, but nonetheless, he clearly had been removed. That was a fact. This was now de facto, everyone could agree, a republic. And so he had already been punished under the terms in which he could be punished, the only terms under which he could be punished in the 1791 Constitution. And since the crown was removed from him, he had done no wrong. No wrong in the first bit because he couldn't do wrong. No wrong in the second bit because if there were any wrong, he'd already been punished for it. No wrong in the third bit because he was now a prisoner of the state. That was the first strand of the defense. The second strand of the defense was these proceedings, we don't refuse to acknowledge them, but they breach not just natural justice, but everyone's understanding of how a criminal trial should go ahead. You are all judge and jury. You are all partisan. Many of the people who are passing judgment on Louis have already announced far and wide across Europe what they think of him. The Jacobins in this room have already said they know what to do with him, which is to cut off his head. A jury that says it has already decided to cut off the head of the defendant is not a fair jury. So, strand two, these proceedings are unfair, not illegitimate, but unfair. But then, maybe spurred on by Louis, maybe spurred on by his own rhetorical exuberance, the defense couldn't resist strand three, which, unlike the first two, was not really a legal defense, it was a moral defense, which is this is a good man, and this man has always done his best by his people. This king was a good king. And all of these charges against him, that he was the betrayer of his people, the shedder of the blood of his people, the enemy of his people, they cannot be allowed to stand. And a counter-narrative was presented, telling the story of Louis's reign, including the crucial years at the end of it, to say that as the King of France, nothing was ever closer to his heart than the love of his people, and he always acted out of his own love for his people. He was, as the divinely authorized protector of his people, completely conscious of his responsibilities, not to betray them. He wasn't a bad king. It's not about whether he was a good or bad person. He was a true king, true to his people. The first line of defense is quite powerful, that these charges can't stick to Louis in any guise in a legal sense. The second strand of the defense is very powerful. This is a show trial. The third strand of the defense was fatally unpersuasive to the people before whom it was uttered. By saying, on top of all of the legal stuff, by the way, I am still essentially a man who understands that he did his duty as king. He sealed his fate. There was no one among the Girondins who would defend him on that front. No one was left in that convention, in that tribunal, who would be willing to accept that on top of all the other issues here, there is the question of whether or not Louis, as king, did his duty as king. And as a result, Louis was convicted, and he was convicted not unanimously, because some people somehow either failed to vote or managed to vote in such a way that people couldn't be completely sure it was a legitimate vote. But all those whose votes were counted on the question of whether or not Louis was guilty as charged of treason, of these crimes against the people of France, every single one voted to convict, and there was no vote recorded to acquit. But that doesn't tell the story, because once Louis had given his defense, There was a gap of a few weeks before the verdict, the judgment, and then the question of punishment was decided. And it was clear after Louis had given his defense that even if there might be some people who were sympathetic, particularly to the first line of defense, which was that under the Constitution he'd already been punished, and people, if not sympathetic, alive to the second line of defense, which is any court that contains a Jacobin in it that's trying a king is not a fair court. The third line of defense alienated everybody. So it was clear the king was going to be convicted. No one could be in any doubt about that. There may have been very little doubt before. There was none after. This man, in some part of himself, as articulated by his lawyer, still thought he was king. So then the Girondins had a dilemma, because if he was convicted, then there was a very good chance he would be executed. The Jacobins would feel vindicated. They would be on the march, on the up. And the one thing the Girondins knew they wanted was not to allow that to happen through this trial. And yet they couldn't acquit the king. That was out of the question. Not one of them was willing to put his name to the verdict, not guilty. So was there any out? Was there any way of putting a wedge between the Jacobin desire to get this man on the guillotine as soon as possible and the Girondin desire, which goes back right to the point when he abdicated, which is just to see if there's a way of not doing that, of delaying it, slowing it down, parking it, putting it to one side? And they came up with a device which was known as the appeal to the people. So the Girondin case had always been the reason we can charge and indeed convict Louis is that he breached the terms of the Constitution. He entered a deal not with us, but with the French people. And the French people can withdraw his protection under that Constitution as someone who breached his contract with them. But we have to ask the people. If we're going to involve Louis in these proceedings, we have to involve the people in these proceedings. So if the conviction is going to be upheld, we as the representatives of the people can't do it ourselves. This convention can't take all power onto itself. The Jacobins thought it absolutely could and should. The Girondins, in this case, wanted to say, it's time to ask the people to confirm the verdict that we have taken in their name, in good faith. But given part of the argument here is whether Louis breached his arrangement with the people, not with us, this convention, no, the people were the other party to the Constitution. They need to be asked. And everyone could see what this was. It was a cop-out. Some of these men were frightened that they would end up having to execute the king. Some of these men wanted to just put a spoke in the wheels of Jacobin triumphalism. Some of them knowing full well that the king had many supporters out in the country, and the people outside Paris were much more ambivalent about the fate of Louis, and much more, many of them, furious about what the revolution had decided about the church, which was a burning issue at this time, and wanted to use potentially the case of the king to fight on behalf of the church. Everybody knew that if it went to the people, there was a very good chance that the verdict would be overturned. But the Girondins weren't even doing it, most of them, because they wanted the verdict overturned. They just wanted not to be the ones themselves who were responsible for the death. And so it looked weak. The Jacobins knew what they wanted, what they were doing, and they were united. The Girondins, faced with the fact that they were going to have to do something probably they didn't want to do, tried to pass the buck and to find someone else to take responsibility for it. So when it came to the judgment in this case, there were three questions that had to be answered. The first question was he guilty? Second question was, should that verdict be put to the people to be confirmed or indeed potentially rejected? And third, if guilty, how should he be punished? But even that makes it sound simpler than it was. So before that could be arrived at, first of all, there had to be agreement on the order in which these questions would be put. So the Girondins wanted the first question to be, whatever the verdict is, should we put it to the people? They wanted the appeal to the people question to go first. So it didn't look like he'd been found guilty. Let's get someone else involved because this doesn't look good. There was the question about whether this would be a public vote or a private vote, in the sense, would all delegates go up and announce their vote, or could they write it down on a piece of paper anonymously? There was the question of the wording of each of these questions, crucially on the punishment question. So one version of the punishment question might be, Do you or don't you vote for death? A yes, no, up, down vote. An alternative would be, what punishment do you think is fitting? There was furious debate on all of this. In the end, it was agreed that the order of the questions would be first, guilty or not; second, do we put this to the people; third, punishment. It was agreed that the votes would be public. Each delegate would have to come up and announce his vote. So every name could be known, everyone would know who voted for whom. And it was agreed that the wording of the third question would not be, as the Jacobins wanted it to be, death or not. It would be, what punishment? And it was left open so that people could say death, or they could say death, but we think that verdict should go to the people. So there were some who wanted to say, we don't think the guilty verdict should go to the people, but we do think that if we sentence him to death, the people need to sanction that choice. And they knew full well that, queasy as they were about executing the king, the people were likely to be a lot queasier. But it also left open the option for people to say not death, I think imprisonment or exile. Exile was a real option here. So after all, what would happen to Napoleon later on under very different circumstances? But Napoleon was not executed at the end of his reign of carnage across Europe, not least because he wasn't, in that sense, put on trial. That was then agreed. Sequence, wording, format. First vote, guilty. Overwhelmingly, the convention said he was guilty. Some, even in passing the guilty vote, had to make a little speech. So one of the things that everybody realized is if this was public in this convention of all conventions where, my God, there were a lot of lawyers for a start, about half of the members were lawyers, and there were a lot of grandstanders and a lot of people who felt that if they were putting their name to anything, they had to give their reasons. Even the first part, which was overwhelmingly, clearly only going one way, as various people came up to give their vote, they had to give their reasons. And in some cases qualify them with hints of regret, just in case something went wrong later down the line. Then on the second question, do we put this verdict, Louis is guilty of the crimes as charged, all of them, so not separately, all of them, all 33. Do we put it to the people? That was not unanimous by any means. That was hotly contested, but in the end, decisively rejected, roughly 2-1. More than 200 people voted to put the verdict to the people, which they knew would probably mean that Louis was acquitted. They were Girondins, but the Girondins split on this question. The Jacobins didn't split at all. They absolutely knew, as many of them genuinely believed, that if that vote went the other way, it would be the end of the revolution. If the verdict against the king was put to the people and the people rejected the authority of the convention to decide such matters, the revolution would fall apart. It would collapse into civil war. For many Jacobins, that question, that second question, was existential for the revolution. The Girondins were conflicted on this. Some of them wanted it, some of them didn't. Some of them recognized that it seemed weak. Some of them felt that it showed they didn't have the courage of their convictions. Many of them believed that they were the appointed representatives of the French people, and they were, therefore, the right tribunal to judge such a question. And if they couldn't judge this question, what could they judge? Was everything going to be put to the people? And so the Girondins split, and because they split, the Jacobin position held. And then the final question, what punishment for Louis Capet, once Louis XVI of France? There were, in the end, 720 votes to be counted on that question. And so it was known that if Louis was going to be executed, at least 361 members of the convention would have to state publicly death with no conditions. So to state death with conditions would obviously delay things. The conditions would have to be met. The conditions might be to allow Louis to appeal, to put the question of his death sentence back to the people, to allow his lawyers to examine the documents. There could be any kinds of conditions. These days, in places that still have the death penalty and still have something that passes for the rule of law, like the United States of America, the gap between the passing of sentence of death and execution is long because a lot has to happen in between. The Jacobins wanted it to be short as possible. They thought the verdict had to be death, no conditions, which meant death almost immediately, within days. So anyone who said death with conditions, anyone who said anything else, imprisonment, exile, would mean that he didn't die. And the Jacobins felt that any delay here would be almost as fatal as putting it to the people. And of course, the most fatal thing of all would be putting any sentence of death back to the French people, because they would reject it. So this part of the counting took a long time because, first of all, it wasn't an up-down vote, which the other two were. First one, is he guilty? Second one, do we put this to the people? The third one was, what do you think we should do by way of punishment? So you could give a long answer. You could give a short answer. One of the most celebrated answers by a member of the convention was the answer of Thomas Paine, the great English revolutionary, the hero of the American Revolution, who remembered that Louis had been, or at least Louis's regime, had been helpful in the completion, the ultimate success of the American Revolution. Thomas Paine was a faintly ridiculous member of this assembly because he couldn't speak French, so he couldn't speak for himself. So in his case, not only did it have to be explained what he was doing, but it had to be explained by someone else on his behalf. Thomas Paine wanted to vote for exile to the United States of America. He wanted Louis to be sent to America to live out his days. The fantasy that's sometimes suggested here, because Louis was very interested in clocks, was he could have become a clockmaker in Philadelphia. Louis Capet, clockmaker on the streets of Philadelphia. Someone should write a novel about that. That was Paine's solution. Mad, quaint, imaginative. Others had to explain they were for the death penalty, but, and if there was a but, it was often quite a long but before we do it, we need to be careful of this or that. There were a significant number who did want to put a penalty of death, which they were in favour of, back to the people. And so they also had to explain how that would work. It went on through the day and into the night, the 16th to the 17th of January, and each vote was counted. There were clerks. It was chaos. People were talking over each other. It was times bordering on anarchic. The stakes were incredibly high. Everyone felt, rightly, that the revolution in some sense was in the balance. It wasn't just Jacobin-Girondin rivalry that was in the balance. It was what kind of revolution this would be and how long it would last was in the balance. And the votes were counted one by one until the final vote was tabled. Reasons given. It was over. It was totted up. And the final number who voted for death, no conditions, death, was 361, which by coincidence was the exact number required for death, which created the view among royalists that Louis was killed by one vote. The next day, when the dust had settled a little bit, but not much, various people said they didn't believe the count. Mainly, actually, that they didn't believe it was that close. Not so much people who said, we don't think actually there were the numbers here to sentence him to death. That was a much more dangerous position, and I think most people sensed they didn't want to be the one who pushed it. There was a recount, and it turned out almost certainly correctly that more votes were cast for death than had been counted. The death votes tended to happen quicker than the other votes, which had to be explained. And numbers were never agreed, 380, 390, close to 400, not just a majority of one. And the verdict was clear. Louis must die. The Jacobin position had prevailed. The Girondins had split during this trial, not fatally, but dangerously. And it was the beginning of the fundamental shift in power. The Jacobins knew from this point on they were in the ascendancy. 4 days later, Louis was executed by guillotine. He tried to take some lessons from the execution of Charles I. He did it with dignity. He tried to present himself as a martyr, not quite the Christ-like martyr that Charles successfully managed to portray himself as to his supporters. Louis's execution didn't quite have the same cachet as Charles's execution because it was one of many. The guillotine had already been quite hard at work, and it was going to be a lot harder at work subsequently. And it wasn't the death of a king. When Charles's head was cut off, it was the head of a king that was cut off, and the awed silence and shock that fell on the crowd had something to do with the thought that something not just politically radical, but potentially deeply irreligious had taken place. There was much less of that with Louis. Louis Capet lost his head, so many did lose their heads, and it was to get much worse. Some people see the execution of Louis as the first act of the terror. It wasn't. The Girondins signed off on this. It was only with Girondin support that this could even happen. The Jacobins didn't have the strength for that. It was a real trial. There was a defence. Okay, many of his legal rights were breached, but still, he was able to offer defence, and in the end, he could have offered a better defence if his lawyer had shut up sooner and not changed his shirt. Compared to some of the executions that were to come in the terror, this was a model of just legal proceedings. This wasn't in itself an act of terror, and I don't think Louis experienced it as an act of terror. It was a trial, but it was a deeply political trial. It was political top to bottom, side to side. Political factionalism, political decisions, political choices, political anxieties, fears about political consequences. That's what drove the trial of Louis XVI. There is another difference with the death of Charles I and its aftermath. As I talked about in the episode on Charles I, the revenge that was wreaked was narrow. It was very targeted by his son Charles II. When he came back, he was going to absolve almost everyone of almost everything they did in the revolution, but he would go for the regicides. He would go for the men who signed his father's death warrant, and he would kill them as traitors through trials that were absolute travesties of justice, and they would suffer the punishment, hanged, drawn, and quartered. They would pay the ultimate price, the horrific price. When the monarchy was restored after 1815 in France, not for long, but for long enough, and Louis's brother, because Louis's son, the Dauphin, who would have been Louis XVII, had died, was another victim of the revolution. Louis XVIII also went after the regicides, but in his case, he didn't want them sentenced to death. They were exiled. And he didn't just go for people who signed a death warrant. He went back through the rolls of the trial itself. He had his officials identify by name everyone who voted for the king's death. And he included in that all of those who voted for the king's death with conditions. So if the ones who thought, I don't dare not say death, but I'm going to hedge it by making it conditional, and so if this backfires, that'll be my get out, thought they were going to get away with it, they didn't. And actually, the way Louis XVIII behaved blew out of the water the myth that this had just been one vote in the end. It was one vote that tipped it. One vote the other way and Louis would have lived, because in the end, well over 400 people, many of them, of course, by that point dead, but well over 400 names were listed among the regicides. Everybody who put their name to anything on the final vote that included the word death. So it was similar, but it was different. It was vengeful, but it wasn't the same kind of vengeance, and it wasn't the same kind of hyper-symbolic vengeance to match the hyper-symbolism of the original execution. The execution of Louis XVI is still a central event in French political history, and France is a republic, so it has complicated feelings about its former kings. But the other thing to say about this trial, unlike the trial of Charles I, is that many people have tried to make it a symbol of something, in the way that Charles I's trial was first made a symbol of the end of monarchy and then made a symbol of martyrdom, restoration, almost resurrection. The trial of Louis XVI doesn't really work as a symbol of anything. Though people have tried, royalists, revolutionaries, republicans, the reason it doesn't work as a symbol of anything is that it really was a trial. It really was a process. It was a process in which lots and lots of decisions had to be thrashed out in intensely high-stakes political arguments between people whose own lives felt like they might be on the line. And it was incredibly messy. It had none of the clean clarity either way of the execution following the non-trial of Charles I. This thing was messy from start to finish, so that if it's held up as a symbol, the danger is people look at it as a symbol, and then they look a bit closer, and the closer you look at the trial of Louis XVI, the only thing it seems to symbolize is the fact that revolutions are wild, chaotic events. It is a symbol not of martyrdom or redemption or revolutionary justice. It is a symbol of the incredibly fraught, unpredictable, hard-fought, wild nature of revolutionary politics. A reminder that if you would like to join us for any of the screenings in our autumn season with the Regent Street Cinema in London, in which we're going to be showing films of ideas, followed by a live recording of this podcast, starting with Alfred Hitchcock's Rope on September the 5th, when our guests will be the crime-writing duo Nikki Gerard and Sean French. Nikki French. Tickets are available now. All you have to do is go to our website, ppfideas.com, click on the events page, and you'll see the details of all of the screenings and how to get tickets. We would love to see you there. Next time in Politics on Trial, something a little different, I'm going to be talking to Gary Gerstle, regular PPF guest and historian of America, about another blockbuster trial, the trial of Aaron Burr, but not perhaps the one you might think. He was never put on trial for killing Alexander Hamilton. This is Burr's treason trial, when he was accused of planning to invade Mexico and break up the United States. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.